It began in silence, in steel, smoke, and secrecy. The year was 1937. Across the world, the treaties that once limited the power of battleships were crumbling. In hidden shipyards, navies dreamed again of monsters. In Japan, those dreams became an obsession. Within a vast dry dock in Kure naval arsenal, the empire began building a weapon unlike anything the seas had ever seen. The plans were sealed under the highest secrecy. Even the workers knew it only as Ship No. 1. It would be a floating fortress, the ultimate symbol of imperial pride. Battleship Yamato. When completed, she would stretch 863 feet from bow to stern, displacing more than 70,000 tons fully loaded, larger than any ship afloat. Her main battery would mount 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever built, each capable of hurling a 3,200-pound shell 26 miles through the sky. To her designers, Yamato was not merely a ship, she was the soul of Japan forged in steel. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had argued that Japan must strike swiftly before America's industry could awaken. The Yamato was built for that philosophy, to stand at the center of Japan's navy, untouchable, unstoppable, invincible. When she slid down the ways in December 1941, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the crowds along the harbor bowed in reverence. Cherry blossoms drifted across the water. The band played the imperial anthem. To the people, she was destiny itself. For years, Yamato's existence remained a secret to the outside world. She patrolled quietly in home waters while other ships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, fought across the Pacific. By 1942, the age of the aircraft carrier had begun to eclipse her purpose. The sea no longer belonged to the gun. It belonged to the sky, yet still, Yamato waited through 1943 and 1944, the tides turned. The U.S. Navy advanced relentlessly, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf. Japan's fleet was shattered piece by piece. Yamato finally joined the fight at Leyte, her massive guns firing in anger for the first time. The thunder of her broadside shook the sea. One American destroyer, caught under her fire, was blown apart in seconds, but even the greatest battleship could not change the new reality. Aircraft, tiny, fragile planes compared to the Yamato, ruled the ocean now. Her armor meant little against bombs dropped from 20,000 feet. Her guns, designed to duel other giants, were almost useless against a swarm of fighters and bombers that could strike from beyond the horizon. By early 1945, Japan's empire had shrunk to a few islands, and its navy was a ghost. Tokyo lay in ruins from American firebombing. Okinawa, the last defense before the home islands, was under assault by hundreds of U.S. ships and planes. In a desperate final act, the Imperial Navy conceived Operation Tengo, a mission so hopeless it bordered on madness. The plan, Yamato, accompanied by a small escort, would sail from Japan to Okinawa, attack the American invasion fleet, and then beach herself on the shore as a stationary fortress until destroyed. There would be no return. The crew would fight and die with the ship. On April 5, 1945, Vice Admiral Saiki summoned his officers aboard Yamato. The ship was anchored at Tokayama, taking on what little fuel remained, barely enough for a one-way voyage. He looked across the assembled faces, young, weary, many of them boys barely out of training, and spoke quietly. Gentlemen, this operation is not one from which we expect to return. Each man must prepare himself. No one protested. They knew already that night, the crew received their orders in writing, the fleet will sortie at dawn. We go to Okinawa to make our final attack. Some men wrote letters home. Others prayed. A few drank in silence. In the mess hall, one sailor muttered, "So this is it. We're going to die for the Emperor." His friend replied, "No, for Yamato. She is Japan now." At sunrise on April 6, the monster came alive one final time. Steam hissed through her turbines. Her engines rumbled with a deep metallic heartbeat that vibrated through the decks. As she moved from the harbor, her escort, 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers, formed up around her from the hills. Villagers watched as the giant ship slid past, her dark hull cutting through mist and morning light. Many bowed low as she passed, unaware that they were witnessing the last voyage of the greatest battleship ever built. On her bridge, Admiral It stood beside Captain Kosaku Ariga. They watched the coastline fade behind them. Ariga spoke softly, "If we succeed, perhaps Japan will remember." It nodded. "And if we fail, at least we will not live to see the end." Below decks, Yamato's gunners checked and rechecked their weapons. Her magazines were filled with armor-piercing shells and high-explosive rounds. The 18-inch guns could fire one every 45 seconds. Each turret was a cathedral of steel, manned by dozens of sweating sailors. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries bristled, over 100 triple-mounted guns, thousands of smaller weapons ready to throw walls of fire into the sky. But everyone aboard knew it would not be enough. Against what was coming, even Yamato's walls of armor could only delay the inevitable. The fleet steamed south through the inland sea, then out into open Pacific. Radio silence was ordered. But American intelligence, decoding Japanese transmissions, already knew. Submarines shadowed their departure, reporting every move. By the time Yamato cleared Kyushu, the U.S. Navy was waiting hundreds of miles away, aboard the carrier USS Essex. Pilots briefed for a strike. Intelligence officers laid out the mission: target, Yamato. Largest battleship in the world. She is headed south. Objective: sink her before she reaches Okinawa. One pilot whistled softly. "That thing's a fortress. How many bombs will it take?" The officer replied flatly, "All of them." The carrier's decks were a hive of controlled chaos. Pilots checked gear, shoved on flight helmets, thumbed bullets into belts, and clambered into cockpits that smelled of oil and hot metal. Intelligence had given them a singular order: find Yamato and sink her before she could reach Okinawa's shores. There was no glamour in the assignment, only the cold arithmetic of strategy and survival. On the briefing table, maps were spread with a single red line showing the battleship's intended course. A young lieutenant tapped the line with his finger and said, "She's big, but she's not invulnerable." The room met that understatement with a silence that tasted like iron. As Yamato steamed south, the Americans closed in. Carrier groups, spread across the blue, launched wave after wave of aircraft. Planes rose like swarms: Hell divers, torpedo bombers, Hellcats, Corsairs, each assigned a target and a time. They would attack in series: bombers to punch holes in the superstructure and deck, torpedo planes to deliver crippling strikes below the waterline, fighters to fend off any Japanese interceptors and to strafe flak crews. The plan was brutal in its simplicity: hammer the ship from all angles until she could no longer float. At dawn on April 7th, the first strike group found Yamato steaming with her escort in a ragged line. Smoke from her stacks drifted lazily, the ocean around her lay deceptively peaceful. The Americans came in low, fast, and in tight formations. The sky filled with anti-aircraft fire, showering orange and black puffs, and Yamato's huge main batteries turned slowly, unable to aim at aircraft that dived from the heavens at hundreds of miles per hour. Her secondary and anti-aircraft guns spat back, throwing up columns of lead and flame, but the sheer volume of attacking aircraft overwhelmed every defended arc from the bridge. Admiral It watched with the same stoic composure he had imposed for weeks. He had commanded men through campaigns that reshaped the Pacific. He had accepted the mission as the unavoidable duty of a dying fleet. On deck, officers shouted orders through the din: "Gunners, prepare! Angle the turrets! Brace the magazines!" Sailors ran to and fro, their faces set in grim determination. Below, in the belly of the ship, stokers and technicians tried to keep the engines humming, though fuel was a whisper, only enough to carry Yamato to Okinawa and perhaps a few more frantic miles beyond. The first bomb struck the deck with the sickening thud of finality. A 1,000-pounder slammed into a turret, shuddering steel and sending splinters of armor and concrete into the air. Men fell into the rain of debris. Fires bit into wooden cable runs, then spread along decks and into compartments. Torpedoes, launched in staggered patterns by low-flying planes, struck with an awful, hydraulic violence. You could feel the ocean change beneath the hull, first a shudder, then a wrench, as each blow twisted ribs and snapped rivets. Pumps screamed, alarms howled. On the starboard side, a torpedo detonated near one of Yamato's thinly armored sections. The hull buckled, water rushed in with a cold, indifferent hunger. A bulkhead burst under the pressure, men were thrown like dolls into corridors turned to rivers. In the forward superstructure, one hit took out communications and part of the bridge, cutting voices and radios to static. Officers shouted, but their orders came dressed in smoke and blood. Gauge needles swung into the red, the giant ship listed faintly, then more steeply, but Yamato did not go quietly. Her big guns, canted toward the horizon, still thundered where they could. The roar of 18-inch shells was a sound no one aboard would forget, an animal bellowing its final defiance. For a moment, a salvo found an imaginary mark, water boiling where a target might have been, a spasm of foam and spray that looked almost like victory. Then more planes came, and the victory dissolved in a new cloud of black. In the smoke and clamor, small human moments surfaced with agonizing clarity. A young gun captain, forcing his crew to reload under strafing runs, muttered, "For the Emperor," and kept pumping ammunition. A radio operator, his hands shaking from fumes and fear, managed a single terse report back to Tokyo before his set went mute. Down in the mess deck, a cook tried to hand out water and rations to men with burns and bleeding faces. No one had time to eat. A priest moved through the wounded, murmuring prayers, his words almost swallowed by the roar of the SEA. As the hours passed, Yamato's fate crystallized in the geometry of damage. Decks were pocked with blast holes, superstructure was a twisted skeleton where once was proud armor. Critical machinery grew silent as electrical systems failed and fires ate through cabling. The anti-aircraft umbrella that had been Yamato's pride thinned, barrels of 25mm and 127mm guns that had once chewed the sky now failed to track the attackers or were destroyed outright. Then the torpedoes reached the keel. Torpedoes detonating amidships and aft created holes that simply could not be managed by pumps and patches. The ship twisted like a wounded beast. A catastrophic list set in. Flooding moved with indifferent greed through lower compartments, seeking equilibrium. Sailors who had moments before been shouting orders found themselves clinging to handrails, sliding in oily water, their boots useless on tilted decks. The great machinery that had propelled the Yamato for a decade of pride and dread groaned, choked, and then died. On the bridge, disaster became personal. Admiral, it was seen below, steady among his officers, as splinters and smoke turned the world into a grey blur. A hit high on the superstructure threw him to one side, he did not rise again. Those who could still move dragged the wounded to safety, those who could not were left where fate deposited them. A succession of small, private acts, handing a flask, reciting a prayer, a last hand squeeze, threaded through the chaos like fragile rope. The final moments were savage and sudden. Fuel in the forward magazines ignited, likely from a combination of blast and fragment heat, and the trapped coal of explosives found the one thing both metal and war had been missing, an oxygen-rich kiss. Flames climbed through corridors, explosions cascaded, each detonation increasing the chance that the ship would break. In a single, horrific crescendo, a magazine blew. The deck rose, rippled, and then folded. Men atop it were hurled into the sky like ragged flags. The sound was not merely loud, it was a rupture in the world, a sound that carved itself into the memory of every witness. When the smoke cleared enough for those still aloft to see, Yamato, once a colossus, was a dying beast. She tipped and turned, her stern lifting as her bow sank into the sea. The final image was an awful, mortal grace, the great guns, now silent, pointing forever at a sky they could no longer reach. Then she slid beneath the waves, her hull drinking the ocean like an inevitable acceptance, swallowing the last of the men who had been her heart. The surviving escort vessels tried to come alongside to rescue sailors, but the sea itself had become treacherous with burning oil, debris, and floating shells. Aircraft, loyal to their orders and the calculus of war, circled to strafe any survivors visible on rafts or debris, an ugly reality of modern naval battle where mercy was a risk the attackers could not always afford. Many Japanese sailors clung to wreckage in the black, reeking water. Some were rescued days later by small boats or left drifting until the cold and the sharks did what war now did in private. When the smoke finally dispersed, the ocean settled like a wound that had been stitched shut with blood and iron. Yamato was gone, consumed by the same technology that had made carriers the masters of the sea, air power. The shock was not only tactical but symbolic. For decades, nations had measured each other by the size of their guns and the number of dreadnoughts in harbor. That measurement had been rendered obsolete in a few frantic hours above the blue. News of the Yamato's sinking rippled through the world. In Tokyo, the announcement was dressed in ritual gravity. The state declared mourning, poems were read on radio waves, the official announcement spoke of noble sacrifice rather than strategic collapse. In the United States, analysts and sailors alike recognized the moment's import, the final unmasking of naval myth. War at sea would henceforth be decided by aircraft, logistics, and industrial output, not by the duel of leviathans. For those who had served aboard Yamato and somehow survived, the aftermath was a different kind of battle. Many would carry the memory of that day like a physical wound, flashbacks of the heat of explosion, the taste of cordite, and the helplessness as decks tilted and water poured in. Some survivors spoke later of the strange peace that came before ruin, moments where men sang quietly, where old jokes were told, where shared cigarettes offered more courage than any briefing. Others could not speak of it at all, their memories sealed by the trauma of being among the dead. In the months and years that followed, the wreck of Yamato lay on the ocean floor as both a grave and a story. Divers and later historians would comb reports, sift survivor testimonies, and assemble the narrative of those final hours. The rusting hulks of what had once been a symbol of national pride became, over time, a testament to the cost of war and the evolution of military technology. Where Yamato had once been a promise of invincibility, her absence spoke the opposite truth, that even the mightiest creations are temporary against a changing world. In quiet corners of Japanese towns, old men who had served remembered the ship as a home and a coffin. Families placed small altars for the sons who never returned. Across the Pacific, younger sailors who had been part of the attack rarely boasted, they spoke in measured phrases, aware that their victory had been as terrible as it was decisive. Pilots who had returned to carriers took off again, their horizons filled with new missions and new targets. The war pressed on until summer's end, until surrender and the long slow return of bodies and bones. Yamato's last voyage marked the end of an era. The age of the battleship, the colossal, armored statement of naval doctrine that had dominated early 20th century strategy, ended not because the ships were poor in construction but because the nature of war itself had altered. Aircraft, submarines, and logistical mastery redefined power. The great guns that once thundered across oceans became relics, their places taken by wings and steel that could strike from 1,000 miles away. Yet, for all that, Yamato did not disappear into myth alone. She remained a lesson etched in iron and salt, a reminder that pride without adaptability is a brittle thing, that symbols do not a strategy make, and that human courage, whether in a roaring carrier deck or in a crowded ship's hold, remains the raw material of history. Years later, divers would find her on the seabed, an enormous silhouette encrusted with coral and crustaceans, the lines softened by time but the scale unmistakable. They would bring back photographs, the sweep of a turret, a twisted ladder, the suggestion of a life halted mid-motion. those images would circulate in museums and books, teaching new generations the story of how the world's largest battleship had met a sudden, modern death. The memory of Yamato endures not as a simple tale of triumph or defeat but as an elegy for the transition between epochs, a last thunderclap for an age when armor and gun mattered most, and a first whisper for the era of the carrier, the plane, and the electronic mind that now guided war across oceans. In the end, Yamato's last stand was both splendid and tragic, a ship of unimaginable might cast down by a new kind of might, and a people's hope anchored finally to the hard fact that even legends can be sunk. In the days following the sinking, the waters south of Kyushu were thick with oil slicks, fragments of steel, and the drifting remains of the once proud Yamato. Fishermen from nearby islands would later speak of seeing wreckage wash ashore for weeks, burned timbers, twisted metal, and the pale bodies of men carried home by the tide. For many, it was the first tangible evidence that Japan's invincible fleet, the pride of the empire, had finally been broken. The Imperial Navy tried to mask the scale of the disaster, but whispers spread quickly through bases and port towns. Families of sailors received terse telegrams that said little, "Your son has died in honorable service to the emperor," with no mention of where, or how, or why. Mothers went to shrines with photographs and incense, fathers stood in silence, smoking under the eaves. The loss was not only of a ship, but of faith. Yamato had been more than steel, it had been the embodiment of Japan's will to endure. And now, it lay silent beneath the waves. In Tokyo, the war raged on. The mainland shook under relentless bombing raids, cities burned by night, and rice was rationed by the grain. The emperor's voice still spoke of victory, but fewer believed it. Among the officers who had designed and built Yamato years before, many could not bring themselves to speak of her end. One engineer, who had worked on the ship's massive engines, later wrote in his diary, "We gave her the heart of a god and sent her to die like a man." American reconnaissance confirmed the kill within hours. Aerial photographs showed the massive oil fires and the spreading debris field. In the ready rooms of carriers like USS Essex and USS Bunker Hill, pilots gathered around grainy prints and knew they had struck the death blow to Japan's surface navy. There was relief, but also a strange quietness. Many of them, veterans of years of combat, understood that what they had destroyed was not just a target but the last echo of an older world. For the men of the U.S. Navy, Yamato's destruction was the culmination of everything learned since Pearl Harbor, the shift from battleships to carriers, from gunfire to air power. It was proof that the new doctrine worked. Yet, the stories told in the mess decks that evening were not of triumph but of the terrible sight of that giant ship dying. One pilot, who had dropped his torpedo at point-blank range and barely escaped the shockwave, later said, "When she blew, it was like watching a mountain sink." Below the surface, in that cold, eternal silence, Yamato settled on her side, broken, yet majestic even in ruin. Her great turrets had torn loose from their mounts, falling beside her hull like fallen monuments. Around her lay the scattered bones of nearly 3,000 men. They were young and old, officers and sailors, mechanics and cooks, bound together forever in the ship that had been their world. Over time, the sea claimed them all, wrapping them in sand and coral, preserving their story in a cathedral of darkness. In post-war Japan, as the ashes cooled and the empire dissolved, the story of Yamato was whispered, then remembered, then studied. At first, it was told as a tale of tragedy, a symbol of waste, of arrogance, of the futility of resistance. But gradually, it became something else, a story of devotion, of courage against impossible odds. The sailors who went to sea knowing they would never return became national symbols of loyalty and sacrifice. Filmmakers, writers, and historians would revisit the last voyage again and again, each generation finding new meaning in her fate. To some, Yamato was the last breath of feudal honor in a modern war. To others, she was a cautionary tale, a monument to the blindness of pride and the price of isolation. And yet, for those who knew the sea, the story of Yamato remained deeply human. The ship had not sunk because her men were cowards, nor because her steel was weak. She had fallen because the world had changed faster than her creators could imagine. The sky had become the new ocean, and Yamato, for all her grandeur, could not fly. In 1985, Japanese and American divers jointly explored the wreck. They found her resting nearly 1,400 feet down, her bow embedded in the seabed, her stern torn away by the explosion that had ended her. They placed memorial plaques and carried back images of her guns, still pointed defiantly toward the surface. The photographs moved an entire nation. Veterans wept to see their ship again, not as a war machine, but as a grave, a place of peace. In one of those expeditions, a diver reported seeing a teacup wedged in a bulkhead, still upright after 40 years underwater. Another found a rusted bell with the faint etching of a name, its sound forever silent. Those small, human relics became reminders that war's cost is always measured in lives, not tonnage. Even now, the name Yamato carries weight. It appears in literature, in film, in ships reborn in spirit if not in form. Japan's post-war maritime self-defense force named ships after her escorts, Yahaji, Isokais, Asashimo, and each bore the quiet dignity of that lost generation. The word Yamato itself became shorthand for the Japanese spirit, endurance, pride, beauty, and tragedy intertwined. If you visit the Yamato Museum in Kyoto today, you'll find a scale model of the ship stretching the length of a hall. Children walk beside it, craning their necks upward, and veterans sometimes stand before it with bowed heads. There are photographs of the men, letters recovered from wreckage, and a map tracing her last journey south. A voice on the audio guide says softly, "She sailed not to win, but to die with honor." It is a story that belongs not just to Japan, but to the entire world, to anyone who has seen technology outpace tradition, or courage swallowed by the turning tide of time. The sinking of the Yamato was not merely an end, but a transition, the death of one kind of war and the birth of another. The ocean still holds her secrets. Sonar scans show fragments of her hull scattered over the seabed, the outline of her bridge faintly visible through layers of silt. Schools of fish drift through the shattered gun barrels. Coral grows on the rusted armor. Nature, as it always does, reclaims the instruments of man's fury and makes them part of its quiet kingdom. If you listen to the sea there, on a calm day, some say you can almost feel the echo, a vibration deep in the water, like a slow, eternal heartbeat. It is not the sound of war or glory, but of remembrance, because Yamato, the ship that was born to be a god of war, found her immortality not in victory, but in her fall. She became a story, one told in classrooms, in documentaries, in the hush of museums, and in the hearts of those who still gaze across the Pacific and wonder how courage, pride, and tragedy could live so closely together, and so the legend endures. Beneath the calm waters of the East China Sea lies a world of steel and silence, a tomb, a testament, and a warning. The waves whisper over her name, erasing nothing, forgiving nothing, remembering everything. The Yamato sleeps. But her story never will.